Alrighty, I have a question for the group. Has anyone here ever had a terrible boss? And here, ever had a terrible boss? Oh my gosh, I know what it is about terrible bosses, but it's just the worst. Anyone here ever heard of a man named Ryan Graham before? Nah, joking, he's a great boss. For me, I had so many. At Austria, I had like 6 written down. I was like, which one do I share from? And so I've got maybe 1 or 2 I'll share. But when I was in Canberra, internship, youth ministry, young adults ministry, but I was working on the side in before and after school care. And it was this independent Christian school, and they kept having promises that I could become like an SLSO, it's like a student learning support officer. They use a different term there. But every time I get to the end of the term, they'd be like, sorry, next term, or sorry, next term, or sorry, next term. This has gone on for like 18 months. Like, it's a long time. And they still will not give me this position because they wanted me to stay in the other space. I was doing a service for them in the before and after school care. And then all of a sudden, COVID hits and things are shutting down and they're really struggling financially. And they just conveniently lose all record that I ever had a contract with them. And so I'm going from a minimum 15 hours a week, but really it's flexing to about 25. And overnight, I'm now working 1 3-hour shift. And they're like, you never had a contract. That never happened. This is a Christian school, right? This is like crazy. Or like I think of another one. I used to work at Woolies. There's one in this area, so I won't tell you which one it is. But I was there and I was working. It's after school, don't really know what I'm doing with my life too much. And the person that is the, store manager is like taking me under their wing and a couple of other people that aren't sure what to do. And like, you know what, maybe I'll pursue this as a career path, not sure. Taking me more and more under his wing, like giving me more and extra time and just giving me extra shifts and cool things I wouldn't normally get to do. And then all of a sudden, he's just not there. And he's not there like the next day and the next day. And I'm like, hey, where is such and such? And no one really kind of tell me. Anyway, it turns out he'd been caught, and I've never seen him since, for embezzling $40,000 from the store. Crazy. And there's just something about like when you hear that people aren't doing the right thing, it's bad enough. But there's something about when it's in a position of authority that it's just worse. There's something that's just worse about it. It's like, man, like, but you're over all these people. Like, there's extra responsibility. There's extra weight to that. And I think there is something just inherently in us as human beings of like, oh, like that's an injustice. There's something not right about that. And so this morning, before I jump in, if you can just pull up the first slide for me. This is an unofficial recap from what Ryan spoke about last week. If you weren't here, you won't be lost. That's okay. But in this book of Ephesians that we're looking at, Apostle Paul writes this beautiful letter to this church. And in this section of it, he's really explaining the concept of godly submission. And last week, Ryan looked at that in the context of marriage. But today, I'm looking at it in the context of families and workplaces. But it's the same idea. It's the same verse that we see up behind me, this idea of submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so we're just looking, what does this concept look like in a family dynamic and in a workplace dynamic? Does that make sense? Following so far? Very good. So quick recap, if you can bring up the next one for me. This Greek word that we get the word submission from, so this word hupotasso, it makes me think of it's a blend between hippopotamus and Ted Lasso and kind of like all squished together. But it's this idea of arranging under. So Abby's gone. The idea of arranging under. And so we've got these 2 things here. In a military sense, it's to arrange troop divisions in a military fashion under the commander of a leader, but in a non-military sense, a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, and assuming responsibility and carrying a burden. So when we're talking about hupotasso, when we're talking about this godly submission, we're primarily thinking of this second one. And I think that there is the essence of the first one in terms of if you are in a position of leadership, you may not be in the military, but you are arranging troops and divisions under you, right? That's a natural thing. But regardless of if you're in a position of authority or not, God calls everyone to live out this non-military version of this. It's this submission and this voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, and carrying a burden. If you can pull up the next slide, this is what we're looking at today. So what does it mean to hippopotamus Ted Lasso in these 4 contexts, okay? So as an employee or a subordinate, as a boss/authority figure, as a child, and as a parent. That's what we're looking at today, and I'm really excited to get to it with you guys. So if you have your Bibles with you, I'm going to be in Ephesians 1-9. I'll be in the New Living Translation. If you don't know what a translation is, the original Bible wasn't written in English, and so people have come and translated it to English, to Spanish, to all these different languages. And so the one that we've been using as a church is called the New Living Translation, or as I like to call it, the New Lettuce Tomato, just for a bit of fun. And so we're going to jump in. I'm going to pull a Ryan in this, and we're going to actually read it backwards. So we're reading 1-9. We're going to read 5-9 first, and then we're going to read 1-4 afterwards. You don't have to understand why. I'm just letting you know that that's what we're going to do, and I can explain it later. And so we're going to jump in Ephesians 6, 5-8. But before we get in at all, I just want to clarify something, because he's talking about masters and slaves here, and I just want to get this off the bat just cleared up. Paul is not advocating for slavery. Paul is not advocating for slavery in this context. It'd be like, if I can give you, this is a weak analogy, but it's probably the best one I've got. It'd be like if we were getting mad that Paul, 2,000 years ago, didn't give any tips or tricks on how to use an iPhone. It would be ridiculous to think that, because one hasn't been invented for about 2,000 years. So this idea of slavery has not been abolished for another 1,800 years. And so he lives in a world where it's completely normal. He's not advocating for it. He's not advocating against it. He's really just talking about it. And so for us as a modern day translation, or a modern day, I guess, extrapolation of that, it's really just bosses and employees. That's really the easiest way to look at it. So that's how we're going to look at it this morning. I'm going to start reading and you can follow along with me. So it says in verse 5, it says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. As slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all your heart. Work with enthusiasm as though you are working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will reward each one of us for the good we do, whether we are slaves or free." So remember, it's this idea of hupotasso. It's submitting ourselves to one another in reverence for Jesus. So I'm going to break this section down, and really there's 5 things that it's talking about here. It's obeying your earthly masters or earthly bosses, serving them sincerely, trying to please them all the time. And that's not in a people-pleasing sense. That's like working well for them so it will be pleasing work to them. It's doing the will of God, and it's working with enthusiasm. So that again, so it's obeying earthly masters, serving them sincerely, trying to please them all the time, doing the will of God, and working with enthusiasm. And the good thing is that there's a reward. It says that actually, don't worry, you'll be rewarded for all the good things that you do, either in this life or in the one to come. This is a pretty straightforward passage in terms of it's saying things that we should be doing, but I want to make things interesting. I want to throw a bit of a spanner in the works. That's easy to do when you've got a good boss. But what happens if you've got a really bad boss? How do you hupotasso? How do you submit? How do you look like Jesus in godly arranging under when you have a bad boss? Anyone can do this when, the sun is shining, but when it's not shining and the dark clouds of, that's a bad analogy, but you know what I'm talking about. This idea of, should we stay or should I quit my job? And I've been in this position many times of being like, should I stay or should I quit when I'm in this position? And I think this is something that I would love to do an entire series on this, to be honest with you, but for the sake of today, we obviously won't be. But I want to give you 3 reasons why actually God's submission, in godly submission, quitting should not be our first reaction. That quitting should not be our first reaction. And here's why. Reason number 1, if we quit, we actually forfeit the ability to represent Jesus to people in that place. There are a lot of bosses that don't know Jesus yet. And if all the Christians just quit every time they don't like something their boss is doing, they will never encounter God. Well, I was just listening to a sermon literally last night from this great evangelist called Todd White, if you know about him. And he was saying that until he got saved, which he didn't give exact time, exact ages, but roughly off his timeline, I'm guessing he was about 30, 35 when he got saved. He said that he had never heard a single person tell him about the love of Jesus until he actually got saved. He had encounters of people saying, you don't want to go to hell, that's bad if you keep doing that. But no one actually told him about Jesus. No one actually ever told him about the love of God. He was able to pass through this world for 30 to 35 years with never hearing the gospel. And so if we have a bad boss and it gets hard and we quit straight away, there are people just like this guy, Todd White, that will never get to experience that. And so actually it's a really good thing just in that alone to persevere, because we want people to come and know Jesus, right? It's the best part about me is that I actually have a relationship with Jesus, and I want people to know that too. Reason number 2, I like this one. If we quit, we rob ourselves of the character growth opportunities. Nothing will grow you quicker than a terrible boss. Okay, there might be some things, but it's a very, very good thing, and nothing will give you a better opportunity. I'll tell you a quick story. After I left the terrible situation with the childcare, I moved from a bad job to a worse job. I moved into hospitality, nothing bad inherently with that industry, but this place in particular, very successful cafe, but terribly ungodly work ethic and culture. And I'm getting like stress headaches in the morning when I wake up. Like it's really, really bad. I'm getting yelled at for huge portions of the day. It was really, really, really bad. And God never gave me permission to leave until I took this job and moved here. And it was really, really difficult for me. And I was like, God, why would you make me do this? Like what's going on here? And the truth is there was lots going on, but one of them was I still very much so struggled with what people thought of me when I would say things, particularly from a pulpit, but just in general. But I'm in a space now where everyone thinks Christianity is really silly. And so I have an opportunity every day to say what I really believe or say what I think people will want me to say. And there was this one guy in particular that was genuinely a workplace bully. There's no other way to look at it. He was genuinely bullying me in this space. But I actually got opportunities to talk about God with him. And when like all the facades came down, all the rubbish came down, I found out he had a terrible, terrible experience in a Christian/Catholic school, and that's just burned him for God. And I'm like, well, that makes so much sense why you hate me, because you had a terrible, terrible experience. And I hope that I could have played even just a tiny bit in helping to salvage that for him, but I was under his leadership and it was actually really, really hard. And finally, with this section, if we quit, we might find that we keep getting employed by the same type of boss and keep getting the same type of issue. And have you ever had that where someone is like, I keep working for this person and they keep getting mad at me for being late, so I quit. And the same boss is now saying that I'm late and he's mad with me, so I quit again. And this boss is saying that they're mad at me for being late, so I quit again. And it's like, maybe we're the problem. That maybe actually we have a problem with tardiness. Like maybe it's actually like when these situations come, it's God giving us an opportunity to grow in these things. And you'll find that if you grow in them and let God do the work, when you leave, you won't suddenly have that bad boss problem again, because it really wasn't with the boss. It was really with us. All right, moving on. Section number 2, employers. I love this. It's short and it's quick, but it's really weighty. So it says, masters, treat your slaves in the same way, or bosses treat your employees in the same way. Don't threaten them. Remember, you both have the same master in heaven, and he has no favorites. When it says treat them in the same way, it's the exact same 5 instructions, but in reverse now. So it's still that same thing. It's still treating their employees with deep respect and fear, serving them sincerely, trying to please them, trying to do the will of God, and working with enthusiasm. It's the same 5 things. When he says treat them in the same way, it's the exact same thing. It's just from the different perspective. But he also adds something, and this is really key. He says, remember, you have the same master in heaven. You have the same master in heaven. Do you get what Paul is saying here, why he's drawing attention to this? I think there's a few reasons, but for the sake of time, I'm just dialing in on one. Is that as a master, as a lowercase earthly master or boss, you get the opportunity to represent the master in heaven. You get the opportunity to represent the master in heaven by the way you love and serve the people that have been placed under your care. So it doesn't matter if you're a boss, employer, department head, pastor, parent, whatever that authority role is, you get the opportunity to represent God and make him attractive to people. To make him attractive to people. One of my favorite authors, his name is Jordan Rain. I'm reading a book of his at the moment. He's a Christian author and epic business CEO. He's not a pastor. He's a author and CEO. And he says the more that he grows in his entrepreneurship, for lack of a better word, he's making more money, building bigger businesses, having more influence with people, the more people talk to him about Jesus because he looks nothing like the other CEOs. He sees them as people, not numbers. He cares deeply about their health and their family's health and all these things. And he gets asked, what's the secret all the time? He's messing with people's paradigms and with their thoughts and beliefs about what a boss should look like. And he gets these epic opportunities to tell them about God. He'll be like, do you really want to know? And they're like, yes, I'm dying to know. Why are you so different to all my other bosses? And he'll be like, it's the love of God. And then he preaches to them. And he's won so many people to Christ just by being a good boss. So for all the masters in the room, all the bosses in the room, department heads, whatever that is, I have a question for you. If someone or when someone works for you, in whatever capacity that is, does it make them want to know more about God? Does it make them want to know Jesus more and to follow him? I think that's a really great litmus test. Being like, actually, with people under me, do they want to be more like the Christ in me? Do they want to know God more? I think it's a really, really good test. And the reverse of this is true. If you can pull up the next slide. So the reverse as a servant is that as a servant, lowercase, we get the opportunity to represent the servant who came down from heaven. So to paraphrase, when we serve well, when we hupatasso well, when we submit well, you get a chance to look like Jesus. You get a chance to look like Jesus for people in the way that you love and serve the people that have been placed over your care. And so I guess the same question applies of when you're under someone and you serve them well, does it make them want to be more like Jesus? Does it make them want to ask questions about that? Because according to this passage, it actually should. And for me this year, I'll tell you a quick story that we had a youth leader retreat in July. We have one every year. And we've had some epic changes that have come in this term. But what was really fascinating is it didn't come from a big move of God, didn't come from a big plan, didn't come from some crazy idea that I had. What it actually came from was me apologizing to the group for my poor leadership. It was me coming in and saying, guys, I'm so sorry for all my micromanaging. There's actually a deep fear in me. I've had bad experiences in the past. If I give too much to my team, they're going to let me down and they'll let the youth kids down. And realizing that I'm not a very empowering boss. And so having a chance to apologize to that. And there was actually kind of some tears and a really beautiful moment. Then we planned the best freaking thing ever off the back of that, and God blessed it. There was something in that. There's power in that, and there's power in leaders apologizing and being real with that and going, I'm trying my best, but I stuffed it up. I'm so sorry. Could you please forgive me? And you'd be shocked at the power of God that is in those moments. Quick question for you is how can you better serve /love /care for those under your authority? And how can you better serve, love, and care for those with authority? We're going to switch gears. We're going to switch into family. We're going to switch gears into family. So you can pull up that slide for me. This is for children. And by the way, you can be an adult child, if that makes sense. All of us have been born by someone at some stage. So this is for everybody in the room. And it says, children, obey your parents because you belong to the Lord, for this is the right thing to do. Honor your mother and father. This is the first commandment with a promise, and if you honor your father and mother, things will go well for you, and you will have a long life on earth. So what's going on here? We'll power through this. It's the same idea of submitting to one another, still hupatasso, still that same idea, but it does look different in a family context. It does look different in a household. But really it's two main things. It's obeying parents and honoring mother and father, which is parents. So obeying and it's honoring. And again, it has this conditional reward attached, just like the employees. It's saying, if you do this, things will go well for you. That's a good promise. I want things to go well for me. And the truth is, you don't have to be a Christian to believe this. You just have to look at some stats. Like there's some things that I was researching in the lead up to this, but there's overwhelming statistics that things go well for kids that actually honor and obey their parents. It's actually wild. It shows that there's a huge correlation for individuals that do this, with like to have a positive relationship with their parents, to have longer and healthier lives. Like it's literally life expectancy. That's cool. They tend to live less stress lives, better emotional health, and have higher satisfaction in their jobs and in their life in general. And it's also, there's a huge link with those who honor their mother and father well to avoid giant pitfalls. They actually make far less big mistakes, and their ability to, I guess, self-sabotage their own life, whether they realize that or not. But I think this is the question that people get stumped on with this. And the question is simply this: how do I honor my mother and father well if what they are asking me to do isn't biblical? Like, how do I honor my mum and dad well if I didn't have a good mum and dad? And I think that's a really real place and a really, really great question to ask. Because actually, sadly, for a lot of people, whether we've been born into a Christian family or a non-Christian family, sadly, there's a lot of really bad parenting experiences out there for people. And there's a lot of hurt and there's a lot of pain with that. And so I just want to stress and say that honoring your parents doesn't mean blindly obeying them, especially in light of things that the Bible would actively teach against. Crazy example, but if your mum was like, kill this person, probably wouldn't do it. Probably wouldn't do that one. A bit of a no-brainer. But it's not saying to blindly be like, well, they said walk, so I'm just going to walk off this cliff because they told me to. It's not that. But there is this posture of honor and deep respect. And so I want to very quickly go through this. But there are three things I think to think about when it comes to honor and respecting, but also obeying our parents. And if you can bring the first one up for me, is that we dishonor, so I'm saying the opposite of these things, but we dishonor our parents by judging them. So we dishonor our parents by, if they've made a mistake, and they're human, so they will. I know I'm making all these mistakes with Eden. I'm just grateful she can't talk right now, so there's no rebuking of me just yet, but it'll come. But this idea that actually we dishonor them by judging them. So by complaining about them behind their backs, by being disrespectful, that would be, like there's so much to this, but for the sake of time, we'll just keep it simple. We dishonor our parents by judging them. The second one being, we dishonor them, and this is maybe hard for some Christian kids, we dishonor them by choosing to follow their example over the example of others. This becomes really, really hard for church kids, I've found. Really hard for pastors' kids, can definitely say that is true for me. And this idea of that, we're like, Mum and Dad, I see what the scriptures say and I love you so much and I want to follow you and want to do what's right, but actually you are teaching something or you are modeling something that I just can't see Jesus saying or doing. And so I love you so much and I have honor and respect for you. I'm telling you this, but I'm going to choose to do what I believe is the right thing. That'll be the other flip side of that. And finally, point 3, this is more the positive wording, but it says we honor our parents by being honest in our assessment of them. So in the Greek, the word honor and honesty come from the same root word. So being able to recognize strengths and weaknesses and being honoring in that assessment. So it's acknowledging like unique contributions to our life, but also acknowledging hurt and pain, but choosing not to judge them in that space and not to wallow in that space, acknowledging that it's happened and maybe getting some help or some ministry or some counseling for that. Like that's a real place that actually sometimes just naming it is enough, but sometimes naming it isn't enough. Sometimes we actually need help to go into those places and to get healing for that. And for me in particular, I want to share one quick story about me with my journey in honoring mum and dad, because I've had a tricky relationship with them in that they're really, really good parents. They're not here, they're in England, no, Canada right now. And so they're really, really good parents to me, and they have been for most of my life, but they were almost too good that I felt like I could never acknowledge any wrongs. And I was often always used as an example for them in teaching, particularly from my dad. And I felt this deep confliction of like, I have to be perfect for you because if I mess up, it'll invalidate what you're trying to teach other people. And so there's huge internal conflict of like, my childhood is really on display as a teaching example. And it kills me because now that I have a kid, I want to use her all the time because it's perfect. But I'm like, oh, I know what it's like to be on the other end of that and that whole like conflict going on in my mind. And I'll share this quick story, and I have shared it before, but I think it's important for people to kind of get this, is that years after leaving home, like 6 years after leaving home, I had this story where I was doing a discipleship course, but without me knowing, I still massively struggle with this topic of submission and honoring to mum and dad. And I'm in a place that is teaching things far differently than what mum and dad would have said. And it's grating me, and I'm actually rebelling against the current authority that I'm in, because to agree with them means to disagree with dad, and I'm so conflicted by that. And God did this amazing work in this exercise where I actually got a chance to essentially confess and say, Dad, thanks for everything, but I'm actually choosing to be my own man now. And I'm actually choosing to submit to God the Father over my earthly father. And I had a massive meltdown in this moment. I cried and I cried and I cried, but it actually opened up an opportunity for me to be able to see areas where they had actually let me down. Because before that point, I couldn't see it because I thought they were perfect and I couldn't possibly go there. But it was this like paradoxical idea of I'm actually honoring them by choosing to deal with the things that they've let me down in. Because by choosing to deal with them, I'm becoming a better son. And so actually I'll honor them far better because I'll become a far better person of God. Does that make sense? But it's really hard because when the kids come and say, hey, Dad, you sucked at X, Y, and Z, our egos get hurt. Like, it's actually really hard. Like, I don't think I'm ready for Eden to say, Dad, you're terrible at this, this, and this. I'd be like, that hurts. Like, I tried really hard, but I still dropped the ball. And to my parents' credit, the amount of rubbish that I've, like, vented at them of, like, you let me down and da-da-da-da-da-da. And I don't even know how much of that was true, to be honest with you. It felt really true, and I think some of it would have been definitely true. But they're like, I just want to honor them this morning, their ability to just let their children tell them how they've let them down and not try and correct, not try and justify, but just say, buddy, I'm so sorry. Will you please forgive me? And just the healing power in that. So healing for me. So healing for me. And I directly credit it to so much of what I get to do now. Because actually, there's areas in me that weren't restored that now are, just from simply an apology and being given permission to say, actually, that hurt. Actually, that was really hard. And so one last thing I want to talk to, and then I want to go into an activation time, is this last verse in Ephesians 6. It's verse 4. It says, Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. Rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. This idea of like parenting, biblical submission, that actually we don't provoke our kids unnecessarily. I think that's a given. But this idea of bringing them up with discipline that comes from the Lord and instruction that comes from the Lord. Note it says discipline, not punishment. And note it says discipline, not coddling. I think for generations before mine, floated far more with the punishment line. But I would say parents my age and people coming up is far more on that coddling end of the spectrum. And it's like, as parents, we are the number one people to get to model what positive authority looks like in our kids' life. And I think of like, because my job as a youth pastor, I'm dealing with other people's kids all the time. And yes, I've got a theology degree or working towards one. I'll have an expertise in that area. But you know what is so hard and breaks my heart? When I'm doing well, it breaks my heart. When I'm doing bad, it makes me mad. I'll be real with you, is that I'll teach something, or we'll as a team teach something, but it contradicts directly something that was taught in that child's home. And do you know who they choose to follow 9 to 10 times out of 10? I'll give you a hint. It's not the youth pastor. They pick mum and dad, which is really, really hard when mum and dad are actually in the wrong. And it's not trying to judge, it's not condemning, all the same things I'm talking about, still honoring godly submission, all those ideas. But so much of my job is investing into kids and then praying it doesn't get squashed when they go home. This experience with this one kid when I was in Canberra, he would come every week and he's like just spitting these absolute gems. And I'm like, how do you come up with this stuff? Like, this is awesome. But he would go home to a non-Christian family and those values and those revelations would get squashed out of him. And he would come back the next week and the slate would start again. And we'd come again and he'd be like, wait, does that mean that? And he's saying, and we're like, yes, keep going, you've got it. He's like, oh my goodness, and he's talking all these things. And he goes back and the same thing happens. It's this thing of like, we are here as a youth team. We want to disciple. We want to train. We want to have a lot of fun and experience God together, create epic worship encounters and eating way too much sugar and all these things like that are just part of being part of the kingdom of God and that expression as a young person. But the truth is that if mum and dad aren't replicating the same things at home, it saddens me to say this, but it's almost a waste of time for me. And I don't say that in the sense of I have better things to do, because I don't have better things to do. This is the best use of my time. But the reason why I share that is because your responsibility as parents to teach and to train and to model at home matters. It matters so much. And I would love it. This is me going off script here. But I'd love to do training for like how to teach your kids how to read the Bible and stuff at home as a church. Because actually that'd be a great use of our time. Like, what if the homes with kids in it were so good that you didn't need to bring them to me? What if they were so good that I go teach them something and they're like, oh, let me show you how it's done, Matt. And they can do it even better than me because they've been doing it since they were 0. Like, what if they were like Eden's age, like 2 months old? Crazy to think she's 2 months already. But imagine from that age, if they were like grown and trained and instructed and disciplined, just how Paul is saying, that by the time they got to youth age, we could take them to a whole other level, that's far beyond what we're doing with them currently, because they'd be like, this is easy. I learned this when I was 3. I can just picture it. It'll be the best problem ever. I would love for a bunch of youth kids to come to me and go, I learned this when I was 3. That'd be the best news I could possibly hear. But it's usually the opposite. I'll say something that I believe is really basic, and I'll be like, I've never heard this before. And I'm like, you don't know who Jesus is? It's crazy. Wow, I've gone off track. Good times, everybody. Good times. One thing I do want to draw attention to, and then we're going to start to move into an activation space, but I can't walk past this, is that Paul actually in verse 4 here, he actually doesn't say parents. He actually says fathers. Paul doesn't say parents, he says fathers. And that is not to say that mums don't have a great role, because I think mums do a phenomenal job, and I genuinely believe it's a 50-50 thing. I think there's a few reasons why he said fathers and not said both, like why he didn't say parents. And for the sake of time, I'll simply say this, is because the damage of the dad dropping the ball is so much greater than the mums dropping the ball. The damage of the dads dropping the ball is so much greater than the mums dropping the ball, and I'll prove it to you with this story. There's a prison in Australia, this is about 20 years ago, and someone who volunteered there had a great idea of doing a Mother's Day stall to make cards for the prisoners. And they loved it. Like, it was close to 100% participation. They're making these cute things and these big burly men that are tatted up, and you wouldn't expect them to make this florally thing for their mum, pouring their hearts out, writing on it. It was the most successful thing they've ever run at this prison. They're like, this is great. We'll go even harder for Father's Day. We're bringing more resources, more teams, more things, and they run the same activity but bigger and better a few months later, and not one card was made. That all these prisoners had a great relationship with their mums. but a terrible relationship with their dads. It's crazy to think that actually they could have this amazing relationship with their mums, but the dads have dropped the ball, and then all this damage comes from it. And I feel such weightiness to this because this is about me now as well. This is about me now as well. And I think for me, what my heart is not to condemn. My heart is to simply inspire and to motivate and be like, dads, like we have extra responsibility. We have extra responsibility. And it doesn't matter if your kid is 2 months old, 2 years old, 20 years old, or, well off into their 40s, 50s, 60s now. It doesn't matter. There's still a really important role that is to be played. And the truth is, with our earthly fathers, they are the number one reflector for kids of what God the Father is like. My role as a dad right now, Eden is very young and she's, just being nurtured and stuff. But when she thinks of God the Father, subconsciously she will think of me and project that onto God, for better or for worse. And my prayer is that with all the love and the stuff I'm trying to pour out, that she would go, well, I like my dad, so the dad in heaven must be pretty good too. That's like my number one job now. I don't get paid to do it, but it's my number one job now is to do that and to be that for my child/future children that aren't here yet. But what I love about the gospel is that no matter how bad your earthly father is, it actually doesn't change how good your heavenly Father is. It'd be like, it doesn't matter how badly someone could come up here and butcher a Taylor Swift song. It actually has no reflection on how good her concert would have been. But it might affect your perception of wanting to go to it. Does that make sense? That's the beauty of the gospel, is that it doesn't matter how bad your parenting or father experience was, is that your heavenly Father is the same God. He's still just as good. He's still just as great. It has never changed. It says he was the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I'm very blessed because I have had a really good dad, but my heart breaks because I know a lot of people in this room haven't. And I don't have a lot of runs on the board. I have 2 months and 1 day. But I would like to, as a father figure, just say to every single person in the room, if you've had that experience where you have not had a good heavenly father, so you haven't had a good earthly father, and it's made you feel that you couldn't have a good relationship with the heavenly Father, I would just love to say from the bottom of my heart, I'm really, really sorry. And that's really, really wrong, and you shouldn't have had that. And my prayer is that you would allow Jesus to come in and heal that, and that you could get this incredible, incredible chance to know what your perfect Father in heaven is like.